we're going to talk this last part about the agony in the garden, which is a specific piece of Christ's passion and also a specific piece of the cross. So it kind of brings together both pieces, the piece on the passion and the piece on the cross. I want to read you just kind of a gathering hymn for this, a piece from the Sufi mystic Kabir, and it's called The Time Before Death. Okay? The Time Before Death. Friend, hope for the quest while you are alive. Jump into experience while you are alive. Think and think while you are alive. What you call salvation belongs to the time before death. If you don't break the ropes while you are alive, you think that ghosts will do it for you afterwards? The idea that the soul will be joined with the ecstatic just because the body is rotten, all that is fantasy. What is found now is found then. If you find nothing now, you will simply end up with an apartment in the city of the dead. That's quite a while. Okay. He says, but if you make love with the divine now, in the next life you will have the face of satisfied desire. If you make love with the divine now, in the next life you will have the face of satisfied desire. So plunge into the truth. Find out who the teacher is. Believe in the great sound. Kabir says this, when the guest is being searched for, it's the intensity of the longing for the guest that does all the work. Look at me and you will see a slave to that intensity. Okay. I want to spend this next section going with you into the agony in the garden, which is an important part of the passion of Christ. Okay. The agony in the garden, that's the transition part from Christ's active life to his passive life. And so we'll see at the end, it's truly liminal space. Today, you know, that word is kind of crept up all over. Well, the agony in the garden, if you ever want liminal space, that's it. You know, Jesus is 33 years old. He's just, done all this work. He's just had about a 4-hour supper with his disciples, celebrated the Passover, and now he has 1 hour to get ready to die. That's a lot of pressure. Okay. 1 hour to say goodbye to the planet. That'll put you into liminal space real quickly. So let's look at the agony in the garden. And I want to begin, and I don't want to pick on this movie, but I want to use it as an entry into the agony in the garden. And that is Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ. Okay. Now, first of all, in fairness to Mel Gibson, he's an artist. He's an artist. So people criticize his theology. It's not theology, it's art. The same as Leonardo da Vinci drew The Last Supper. It's a work of art, And whatever else you can't argue with Mel Gibson, it's a piece of art. And the cinematography and everything else, it's wonderful. It's a great piece of art. You don't have to agree with the art, and what he's chosen to emphasize and so on. But it's a work of art, so you don't disagree with it theologically. Then secondly, it's also a metaphor. Those of you who have seen the film, it focuses almost exclusively on Jesus' physical sufferings. So there's a lot of him getting whipped and falling and getting whipped and falling and so on, to a point where you just get sick of it. At a certain point you're saying, stop it. It's enough with the whips, But remember how Gibson begins the movie. He begins the movie by saying, by his stripes we are healed. And see, sin are the stripes. And so when you get the impression like, will you stop it? That's enough whipping. Gibson wants you to get that. The idea is sin never stops. It just never stops. And so it goes on. It's ugly, but it never stops. It's an art. It's metaphor. Okay? But see, so many people looked at that film and they said, that's it. That's it. But don't get art confused with the scriptures. That's not the scriptural death of Jesus at all. Okay. Let's start with the agony in the garden. Okay? I'll first say something else. Notice and then we'll go in the agony in the garden. When you read the 4 evangelists' account of Jesus dying, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, notice that they almost are at pains not to emphasize the physical suffering. They never emphasize it at all. It's almost non-existent in there. They mention it. In fact, in Mark's gospel, the entire crucifixion scene is written off in one line. They led him away and crucified him. Or someone said, he had him scourged and had him crucified. See, so that there's a deliberateness to not emphasize the physical suffering. Why not? Well, you're going to see that's the entry into the agony in the garden. See, what Gibson did, metaphorically, is he turned Jesus into a physical athlete. This was Rocky V. He simply wouldn't stay on the canvas, you know. And in fact, Richard Rohr wrote a wonderful commentary. Richard Rohr says, for most American men, this was really good. It's exactly what they needed. They always think Jesus is a wimp. They find out, you know, he can take punches with the best of them, you know. He's like Rocky or Stallone. He just won't stay down, you know. But that's not the Gospels. See, in the Gospels, you're going to see they don't turn Jesus into a physical athlete, which Gibson did. They turn him into a moral and an emotional athlete, you know. So what you're going to see, the Gospels don't emphasize his physical suffering at all, to a point where it's almost written away. They let him away and crucified him, because that's not what they want you to get. And the sufferings of Jesus must have been pretty horrific, the physical sufferings. But that's not what they want you to get. You know, what do they emphasize? He was alone, betrayed, abandoned, unanimity -1. Nobody stood up for him. Everybody abandoned him. That he's a stone's throw away. Everybody's leaving him. See, that's the suffering he's undergoing. It's the suffering you're going to see of the lover, not of the king or the magus or the high priest or whatever. And that's why you're going to see the first thing, his sufferings take place in a garden. Let's look at that. It's the agony in the garden, not the agony in the temple, not the agony in the desert, not the agony on a mountain, not the agony in a synagogue. You know, in the New Testament, places are really important. Where something takes place, that's an important part of the homily and the teaching. So for instance, they'll say, Jesus came to his hometown and he went into the synagogue. Inside of the synagogue, you know it's going to be a drama inside of religion. Jesus goes into the desert. You know that's going to have something to do with Satan. Okay? Jesus goes on the mountain, he's going to teach something, and it's going to be very important teaching. God reveals on a mountain, you know. Jesus goes in the temple, that's going to be religion. Okay? What are gardens? Archetypally, gardens have nothing to do with cucumbers, radishes, garlic, you know. Gardens are for lovers. You know, that's why it begins, you have the Garden of Eden, you know, where you have perfect love. But in archetypal literature, fairy tales are archetypal literature. You know, most fairy tales are 6,000 years old. That was all the psychology and wisdom of humanity captured in these tales. Cinderella and so on. But see, in fairy tales, see, the garden is where lovers go. That's where you go to drink wine. That's where people go to make love. That's where the princess takes a bath in the moonlight and shows her beauty. You know, see, gardens are, it's where lovers go. So the fact that Jesus is going to experience this drama in a garden is really important. See, and it's going to be Jesus the lover who suffers, not Jesus the athlete, not even Jesus the high priest, not even Jesus, you know, the magus. You know, that happens in the temple, and Jesus has other dramas there. In the garden, lovers go. So it's Jesus the lover. Let me make that concrete. When I was a kid, and I was catechized by the Ursuline sisters, the same ones my sisters joined. Good teachers, still the best teachers I ever had in the world, including the Jesuits, who do pretty well, were the Ursuline nuns, you know. But I remember one of the ones teaching us catechism, and she says, you know why Jesus sweated blood in the garden? He sweated blood for this reason. See, he was God, and he could see he was going to suffer, and despite the fact that he suffered, so many people were still not going to believe in him, and so many people are going to be lost, so he has all this agony. Well, I believed at the time. Today I'd say, sister, that is a wonderfully pious, beside the point thought. Okay. That's wonderful, it's pious, it has nothing to do with Scripture. Jesus wasn't there suffering, well, I'm going to suffer all this, and they're still going to be lost. No, it's Jesus the lover, you know. And notice even before he goes into the garden, what's he talking about at the Last Supper? Is he telling the last disciples, you know, I'm really scared about these ropes and the whips, and I'm going to get this. It's going to be blood and all. No, he doesn't mention any of that. What they say? You're going to betray me. Everybody's going to betray me. I'm going to be alone out there. You know, everybody's going to betray me. See, it's about betrayal, aloneness, loneliness, emotionality, making moral choice inside of an intense kind of loneliness. See, that's the agony in the garden. Okay, sweating blood. So he's sweating blood not as a king, not as a savior, not as a priest. He's sweating blood as a lover. Okay, and see, that's what the evangelists want you to get. And that's why they don't emphasize the physical sufferings, which must have been pretty horrific. I remember as a kid, and my mother was a ritual genius, you know. She didn't know that, but she was, you know. And we'd come home from school during Lent, Friday afternoons, and we'd have to do the Stations of the Cross. Some of you are old enough to remember that, because sometimes we'd have them at the parish, but we were a country parish and didn't always have weekday mass and so on. So when we didn't have them at the parish, we'd have to do them in our living room, you know. And my dad had this book, which, you know, in fact, my brothers and sisters are all still trying to find that book, just as an example of a bad book. Okay. Okay. But he had this book, A Station of the Cross, and they were divided into two, you know. And first of all, we come home from school, you know, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, sun is shining bright, and we want to go out and play, and then we have to do the Station of the Cross. But my mother, that was a ritual genius, she'd pull the drapes. So she'd darken the room, you know. So you're supposed to be a depressing experience here, you know. You don't have the sun shining in while you're, you know, that's pretty wise. Remember, John said, it got dark in the middle of the day. The Passion, this is not about sunshine, Walt Disney, and rainbows. It's about death, you know. So my mother would drop the drapes, you know, we're kneeling in the semi-darkness. So then my dad would be reading these descriptions, and each station, some of you remember these stations, there'd always be a description of what happened. The first station, Jesus is condemned to death, you know, and Jesus falls the first time. Then there'd be a little prayer at the end, you know. But the descriptions were all Mel Gibson, complete with a picture book, you know. And they whipped him, and they turned him with ropes, and they beat him up, and they knocked him down again. He got him knocked down a second. See, that was kind of the Catholic piety we were raised on, you know. That's Mel Gibson. See, but the emphasis is always, look at what Jesus had to suffer physically. Now, as a metaphor, that's good, you know. But that's not what the evangelists want you to get. They want to say, look at what Jesus went through emotionally, morally. Okay, let's go into the garden with Jesus. What's he suffering? What are the sufferings of the lover? Okay. Some years ago, there's a psychologist at Harvard called Robert Coles. And he wrote a book on Simone Weil, the woman who died during the Second World War. Very independent woman, a very interesting woman, and a very faith-filled woman. But anyway, he wrote a book and he coined an expression which I very much like. He said she was a woman who suffered deeply from moral loneliness. That's an interesting expression. What does it mean to be morally lonely? I wrote a book when I was still a very young man on loneliness, The Restless Heart, which Doubleday has just released again, you know. But at the time, I didn't have that concept in there. I rewrote it slightly afterwards and so on, put it in. But, you know, I had like restless loneliness, loneliness, the blues, whatever, you know, rootlessness and so on. But, you know, the deepest loneliness we have is not the loneliness where you don't have a friend, or you don't have put it this way, where you don't have somebody to sleep with physically or sexually. The deepest loneliness when you don't have somebody to sleep with morally, where in the deepest parts of yourself, you're alone. Or as Gil Bailey says, your unanimity -1. You know, there isn't anybody else like you. See, and inside of that, you have to make a tough moral choice. And that is, you know, when things are going really well, you know, if right now, at a certain point in your life, you feel yourself surrounded by love, by friends, by support, your family is wonderful, your spouse is wonderful, your community is wonderful, your church is wonderful, everybody is just 100% with you, see, then it's easier to give ourselves over. Easier to say, well, I think I can die for this. When it's exactly the opposite. When your spouse isn't with you, your family isn't with you, your church doesn't understand you, nobody understands you, then it's a lot easier just to be bitter and to say, the hell with it all. Let the devil take tomorrow, you know. See, you're experiencing moral loneliness and all that's important to you, all that's, you know, the deepest parts of you, all that's most precious to you, it's not being honored by anybody. In that place, you're alone. And it's those times you have to make your deepest moral choices. That's when you have to decide to be faithful. That's where you have to decide the church is worth it, my family's worth it, God is worth it. You know, it doesn't seem like it today, but they're worth it. You know, see, that's the agony in the garden. I'll give you 2 examples of that. In 30-something, where this man, he's at a party, and this powerful chemistry develops with this young woman there, and that happens. You know, Iris Murdoch, the great British writer, used to say, it takes 15 seconds for the world to change. You can fall in love in 15 seconds. The bad news is you can also fall out of love in 15 seconds. But, you know, this type of stuff happens. So now, when he says, I got to go home, I'm married, and so on, he's sweating some blood. See, that's the sweat of the lover. That's the agony in the garden. Notice he's not thinking about the salvation of the world. He's thinking about his fidelity to his wife. You know, that's the way lovers sweat blood, and so on. See, that's fidelity, and so on. See, and that's what the agony in the garden calls us to. You know, to let go, and the price of that, what it's going to be. So, and in that we're alone. Let me take an image, which I was going to give you later, but I'll take now. You know, notice they say Jesus came out of the Last Supper room in the garden, and then he told the disciples. I'm going to take Luke's gospel. In Luke's gospel, he says, "Watch." Now he didn't say, "Stay with me" or "Pray with me," as he said in the other gospel. He said, "Watch." You're supposed to learn a lesson. They said, "Then he went a stone's throw away." Why a stone's throw away? Okay. Well, that's not so much a description of what happened. That's a description of where we are when we're in this place. You're always a stone's throw away. See, what Scripture is trying to tell us, in a certain kind of aloneness, in a certain kind of pain, in a certain type of loneliness, which is an unspeakable kind of loneliness. I'll talk about that. In that place, you're always a stone's throw away from everybody. Nobody can be with you there. It's not that Jesus didn't want anybody with him. Nobody can be with you there. When my brother-in-law was dying, people were holding his hand every minute, but he was a stone's throw away from everybody. See, you're going to die alone. You know, there's certain things. Somebody can be holding your hand. It doesn't matter. You're a stone's throw away from that. You know, that you're alone in that. You're deeply alone. You know, there's a word for that. People call that unspeakable loneliness. I like that word. Why do we use the word unspeakable? Because there's certain kinds of loneliness that you can talk about. You know, and in fact, very painful kinds of loneliness. Your spouse dies. Your son commits suicide. Those are horrific things, but you can talk about it. Somebody can be with you. Say, you know, I mean, there's parts that people say, you know, or this person left me and I have a broken heart. Partly you're alone, but partly you can talk about that. But there are also many deep parts of loneliness inside of us that you can't talk about, you know, or places you're going to be alone, and you could have the most wonderful, loving spouse or community in the world. My brother-in-law, his family, and his wife really love him. And they were holding his hand till he died, but he was a stone's throw away. You know, you're a place where nobody can be with you. See, so that they want you to get that. Jesus in the garden, in that kind of loneliness, you're a stone's throw away. You know, there's so many little cute, maybe that's not the right word for it, pieces in Scripture where they give you the indication of, you know, Jesus alone. They give you one from Mark's Gospel. Remember in Mark's Gospel, at the Last Supper, Jesus is talking about this. So he says, you're all going to betray me. You're all going to betray me, and not a single one of you is going to be faithful, and so on. And of course, Peter is protesting, even if they all betray you, I'll never betray you, and so on. Well, they all betray. But he comes out of the Last Supper room, and in Mark's Gospel, this grandiose young guy appears, you know. And he's never met him before in the Gospel. This young man appears, and he's dressed in his burial shroud. And he says to Jesus, I'm prepared to die with you. And to prove it, I'm already dressed for burial. And even if all these people abandon you, I'll never abandon you. Well, you know what happens? The first soldier comes. This young guy is scared stiff. They said, and he left his clothing, his white cloth, and he ran off naked into the night. Why naked? Mark wants to get this kind of almost funny. See, at the beginning of Mark's Gospel, they're leaving everything. Father, mother, fishing nets to follow Jesus. He said at this point, they're leaving everything, even their clothes, to get away from him, and so on. See, when we're in this space, we're deeply, deeply alone. See, that's the archetypal place. That's the garden, you know. And as Jesus prepares to ready for his death, he's in the garden, okay? And the garden's the place for lovers. See, and he invites us there. Those are the deep pains we experience in our moral loneliness. What Jesus illustrates for us in the garden is not the physical athlete. Look what he can endure. The emotional athlete, the moral athlete. The person who can absolutely, when you're alone, without support, you know, still give your life over without bitterness. Like I said, it's a lot easier to do when everybody is supporting you and everybody's loving you, and if you belong to a perfect family, had a perfect spouse, had perfect kids, a perfect church, a perfect everybody who loved you, it'd be a little bit easier. But when you're hung out to dry and nobody can be with you, and in that moment, that's where you have to make the critical moral choices. I won't have an affair. I won't break my vows. I won't become bitter. I won't leave the church. I will stay and I'll give my life over without resentment. That's the pain of the lover. And it's not abstract. It's not like the good Ursuline sister said, he saw the sins of the world and so on. No. That's the person at the party saying, I got to go home. I'm married. My dad got that. He said, unless you learn how to sweat blood, you'll never be true to anything in your life. And not just in terms of breaking vows or breaking marriage covenants, but especially in terms of bitterness. See, a lot of times, us sensitive people, we don't necessarily have affairs, and we don't necessarily break our marriage vows or our religious vows and so on. We just, when we get really lonely, we get real bitter and angry. And see, then remember, then we're not connecting our passion to Christ's passion. Can we give it over and give it over without resentment? That's the key. See, that was Christ, and that's a great moral leap. That is moral athleticism. That is real moral athleticism. It's Christ, the moral athlete, who is our Christ, the emotional athlete. That's the emotional athleticism, not physical athleticism. Christ wasn't Bruce Willis, Rocky. Look how much pain I can endure for you. Christ was a moral athlete. That's what we're asked to imitate. When you're a stone's throw from everybody, and especially when the deep things in terms of your love are at stake, can you sweat blood and give it over and not be resentful? So that's what we're called to in the garden. That's a particular kind of sacrifice and so on. And that's the essence of discipleship in the Gospels. Can we give that over? And a lot of times we aren't called to that at that radical level. When we say that Our Father, and we say, give us today our daily bread, forgive us our trespasses, and lead us not into temptation. And then I like the other biblical version better. We say, and do not put us to the test. See, we say, but save us from all evil and so on. I like the other biblical version which says, do not put us to test. What's the test? This is the test. You know what we're saying when you see what Jesus underwent in Gethsemane and on the cross, where he was really tempted to despair, when he was really tempted to give himself over to bitterness, to anger, to atheism, to whatever, because it was all dark, and he didn't, When we say do not put it to the test, do not put us to the test, that's the test we're talking about. Essentially, we're telling God, could you cut me some slack? So that, what Jesus underwent, if you could save me from tasting that in its depth, I'd really appreciate that, Is there some easier way that I can get through life and my marriage, my vocation, and so on? And maybe God will do it for you, Maybe God isn't going to ask you to be the ultimate athlete. But there's an interesting thing there. Who does God ask of it? Let me give you a story. You've maybe read this. It's a wonderful illustration, but Henri Nouwen writes the story on his mother's death. If you find this little book, you can read it in a couple of hours, called In Memoriam. And he writes the story. He says, he said he was teaching at Yale at the time. He's from Holland. He was teaching at Yale, and he says, my mother was the most Christian woman I'd ever met. He said, my mother, she said she just had this 1 in a million faith and gave her whole life for Christ, and she'd always prayed that she'd die like Christ and so on. And he said, so he got a phone call at Yale that his mother's dying, he should come home. So he got on a plane, he said, and he was praying on the plane going back to Holland. And he's thinking, this is going to be Mother's way of capping off, like giving her death to us. She lived this wonderful life, she gave her life for others, now she's going to give death for others and so on. But he got a real surprise. He got home, he says, my mother died a pretty awful death. She was fighting, there was darkness, she was fighting bitterness, she was terrified, she was afraid, and he said, no, he couldn't figure this out. Like, here's his mother with this great faith, with all this stuff, and she dies like that. And he said, and that's the way she died. He said, I was flying back on the airplane trying to figure out, how do you put this together? He said, till suddenly I realized it all made sense. He says, my mother prayed her whole life that she'd die the way Jesus did, but look how Jesus died. He didn't die like Socrates, calm, serene, death, bring it on. He died afraid. He died at the edges of darkness. Iris Murdoch says, a common soldier dies without fear. Jesus died afraid, you know. See, because she asked to die like Jesus, so she ended up dying like Jesus, you know. See, where she was given the test at the end. See, to a lesser person, God probably wouldn't give him the test. See, he gave the test to his son. He gave it to Henri Nouwen's mother, you know. So we should always be careful what we ask for in prayer, because God may well give it to us. You know, John of the Cross has a great line like that too. John of the Cross says, you know, when you're young in the spiritual life, and you always pray to God, and he said, what you should pray is to put on the motivation of Jesus. Like he said, don't pray to imitate Jesus' actions or whatever. You pray to feel like Jesus. Pray to Jesus, say, make me feel like you. That's the way you put on the mind of Christ. He said, but then be prepared for some surprises, you know. So at a certain point, you're going to feel really good and you want to save the world. And then at a certain point, you're going to feel like there isn't any God. You feel empty, had, abused, misused, frustrated, dry. And you start saying, what's wrong? What's wrong? He says, nothing's wrong. Your prayer worked. You've prayed to Jesus, Jesus, make me feel like you. And he said, I'm just answering it. That's the way. You know, Henri Nouwen, why did his mother die? She prayed, God, Jesus, let me die the way you did. So she did. Remember on the cross, this is not a Disney production of Jesus dying on the cross. And God gave Jesus the ultimate test, the ultimate, right to the edges of despair. Do you really believe in light, in love, in goodness, when there's darkness, hatred, everything around you? Can you give your spirit over inside of that? See, that's the garden taken yet to another extreme the next day, you know. See, but that's the test. When you say the Our Father, say, and do not bring us to the test. Don't give me the test. That's the test, you know. If you're like Henri Nouwen's mother said, you're telling God, give me the test. I want the full test. I want to give you a great little story. It's a little side story, but it's a good one on this. I was once a spiritual director to a young man who was 24 years old and one of the truly mature people I've ever met, you know. And he was deeply in love at the time. He was also trying to decide, he was discerning between a religious vocation and getting married, you know. And it took about 2 years to discern this thing. And very mature young man. And he told me, he says, you know, he says, I want to be a priest. But he says, I'll tell you what's blocking me from being a priest. He said, when I was 15 years old, he said, and I was the oldest son in the family. He said, my dad died of a heart attack. He said, he said, we lived in an acreage about 15 miles out of town. And he had a heart attack one night, just before supper. And he said, we weren't the type of family you phoned an ambulance. We gathered him in the station wagon. So he's in the back seat with my mother, and I'm driving the car. I'm 15 years old. I'm scared stiff. My dad is dying. And in fact, he did die on the way to the hospital. He said, he died in my mother's arms. And he said, I always thought, that's the way I want to die. He says, as sad as it was my dad dying, I thought, that's the way human beings should die. He said, my dad died in my mother's arms. He said, that's the way you exit the planet. He said, I always thought if I become a priest, I won't die like that. I want to become a priest. So till one day I was praying, I thought, well, Jesus didn't die like that. He died different. That was a good way to die too, you know. See, Jesus died in somebody else's arms. Actually, we're meant to die in human arms, but in the arms the way Jesus died, ultimately in his Father's arms, and abandonment, you know, after that great, great test, which begins in the garden. See, we're all going to get the test in the garden. We might not get the test fully the next day, you know. But the garden, the test of the lover, see, the part of you that loves, the emotional part, the moral part, that's not the priestly part and the liturgical part and all that other stuff. Those aren't your great tests. Ultimately is, can you give your heart over in love when you're abandoned, alone, and it's going to cost you everything? When you have to sweat blood. That's such a wonderful image from Luke. To do this, Jesus literally had to sweat blood. And that was my dad's great metaphor. Learn how to sweat blood. See, that's the lover's test. Okay, see, that's the garden. Now, and like I said, that's an invitation to become morally athletic. You know, in our culture, I'll give you one last little thing here. I'm getting a little sidetracked, but these are important. You know, it's interesting. Our culture, in terms of discipline, see, discipleship is after the word discipline. A disciple puts themselves under a discipline, okay? And sometimes you read things about, spiritual writers write about our culture. They say, we have the flabbiest culture ever and so on. Is that true? Absolutely not. In some ways, we got the most disciplined culture ever in some aspects. This sense, See, today, for instance, in terms of physical discipline, we're probably the most disciplined culture in history. I'll give you kind of a humorous example. A few years ago, the Archbishop of Winnipeg up in Canada, because in Canada you only have to fast 2 days a year now, Good Friday and Ash Wednesday, So he put out a decree in his diocese. He said, now you're not required to fast, but I invite you to fast voluntarily. And then he sent out the old rules about this is what it means to fast. You know something? It was a huge joke. Most of the people in the diocese were laughing at it. Why? Because for most people, they would have had to increase their intake to meet the fasting requirement. Remember the old fasting requirements? You're only allowed to eat 1 heavy meal a day and then 2 light meals a day. Half of our society is living on alfalfa sprouts and celery sticks. And they would have to radically increase their intake to fast, And that was a big joke. Everybody's fasting all the time, You might allow yourself some chocolate on a Sunday if it's right, and you haven't gained a pound that week and so on. See, and people drive by McDonald's and they think trans fats and they think this is like a pornography. My God, And they're scandalized. Some people actually take their kids there, See, so in terms of physical discipline, everybody's jogging and everything else. See, and that's good. That's physical discipline. See, but that's physical asceticism. But where our culture lacks, oftentimes we don't have any emotional asceticism. We don't have any moral asceticism. I know people who would be horrified at the idea of eating a McDonald's hamburger, but they'll watch pornography. Where's the inconsistency there, See, so it's not like our culture doesn't understand discipline. We're the most physically disciplined culture, okay? But physical discipline is not what the Agony in the Garden was about. The Agony in the Garden is about emotional and moral discipline, See, that's where Mel Gibson, for all his artistic wonder, he didn't get it, See, because again, he turned Jesus into a physical athlete. That's not the Agony in the Garden. And if you don't believe me, just read the evangelists. They just mention in passing that there was physical suffering. The real suffering is the suffering of the lover. And that's why it's the agony in the garden. It's not the temptation in the desert, the synagogue, and so on. Now, a few other things just to wrap up here. Some of the lessons in the agony in the garden. I've already given you the one about a stone's throw away, See, one of the things they want you to get is when we're undergoing that kind of pain, we're always going to be a stone's throw away. It's something you're in alone. You're in a certain unspeakable loneliness. Secondly, the disciples were asleep out of sheer sorrow. That's quite an expression. That's Luke's expression. They said Jesus went a stone's throw away and he prayed, And then he came back at a certain point and looked at the disciples and said, and Luke said they were asleep. And why were they asleep? Well, they'd have probably had every reason to be asleep. This probably was about 11:30 at night. They had had a 4-hour dinner with probably 4 cups of wine apiece. I don't like your chances of being awake very much after that, But that's not why they were asleep. It wasn't out of tiredness. Luke said they were asleep out of sheer sorrow. What is sheer sorrow? They were asleep out of depression. They were too depressed to see the lesson. See, just before that, Jesus told them, watch, they're supposed to learn something. Even though it's a stone's throw away, they were supposed to hear this and they were supposed to learn something. And when he turns back, they're asleep. And they're asleep because they're too depressed to get it. I like that expression because in our lives so often, that is really our problem. Not ill will or whatever. We're asleep out of sheer sorrow. I'll give you a very strong example today. Today in the Catholic Church in the United States, the sexual abuse crisis. Is anybody getting it? The bishops, the clergy, the lay people? No. And we're not getting it because we don't mean well. It's just too depressing. It's too depressing for the bishops. It's too depressing for the priests. It's too depressing for the lay people. We're just asleep out of sheer sorrow. It's just, there's a lesson to be gotten. There's something we need to get here. We're in the desert, and we're not going to get it. We're going to get it eventually because it won't go away until we get it. See, the desert never goes away until you get it. That's what 40 days mean. How long is 40 days? We're going to be 40 days or 40 years with a sexual abuse crisis. It stays till we get it. And what does that mean? Until we get the lesson we're meant to get. But oftentimes the lesson comes slowly because we're just too depressed. It's too depressing to think about. Okay? See that connection between humiliation and glory. Isn't it necessary? There's a necessary connection between a certain type of suffering, humiliation, and glory. And oftentimes we don't see it because we're too depressed. It's too depressing. I cannot accept this, you know. Asleep out of sheer sorrow. Then stones throw away. Then the idea of the agonia, the sweat, you know. The sweat is double. See, when it said Jesus sweated blood, he went into an agonia in Greek. That has a double meaning to it. The one of them you have, see, it's the sweat of the lover, okay? You know, that's the sweat of the guy leaving the party because he's got to go home because he's married and he may not have an affair. That's the sweating blood. But sweating blood in a different sense. See, this is a pun for a Greek athlete because it's an athletic image. See, what an athlete would do, they do that today too. An Olympic athlete, they don't just go out to run the 100-yard dash cold. They don't, you don't have to go out and do pole vaulter in the Olympics cold. You warm up. But in those days, what athletes would do is they would work themselves into a lather. See, they would first get themselves really all their muscles warmed and pumped and have a good sweat, and then you go out. That's when you run the 100-yard dash. You got a good chance of winning it then. You just don't walk, you've been sitting on a sofa, you walk out and let's do the 100-yard dash. No. Now, there's an important moral principle. See, Jesus worked himself into a moral agonia, an emotional agonia, see, which then readied him for his death, which is going to be the great moral combat. See, there's a lot of lesson in that. See, simplistically put, I can't go from a pampered lifestyle to being a martyr overnight. How do I walk if I'm pampering myself, I don't discipline myself, I'm lazy, I may not be a bad fellow. I just don't walk from that to martyrdom. I got to first work I got to work my muscles up, my moral muscles. Our moral muscles need to be exercised. We got to be ready. That's why in old spiritual literature, they always talked about vigilance. You got to live in vigilance. It might be a really good time for you right now, but don't get too restful in it, So you got to live in a certain vigilance so that when you're called, you're ready. You never know when you have to do the great moral combat. You got to live in readiness, in a state, be ready. Your moral muscles got to be worked all the time. You got to be ready so that you can't, move from self-pampered to martyrdom without the agony in the garden in the middle. See what the garden does, it's an interesting thing to think about. See what all these lonely bouts do, and the times they go through unspeakable loneliness and so on. What they do is they ready us. So when the great thing comes, we're ready. When we enter the great loneliness of death, when we enter the great loneliness of palliative care or whatever, we've had some experience. You've been in the arena before. It's not the first time you've been asked to run that dash, See, so that it's kind of the mystics say God gives you little tests here and there and readies you, and so that that when you run the Boston Marathon, you've done a little running before, See, when we enter the great combat, we've had some other combats. You've been to that garden before. You've had a sense of what it's going to cost. Your muscles are ready. You've been in agonia before. Then it's a place of special prayer, the prayer of helplessness. When you analyze Jesus' prayer in the garden, and I don't have a lot of time here, I just want to name some parts to it. Let's center 4 parts to that. Jesus' prayer there to the Father is the structure of the prayer we need to say when we feel particularly helpless. When you have nothing left inside of you, that's our prayer. There's different kinds of prayer in Scripture, but that's the prayer of ultimate helplessness. And notice how it starts. He says, Abba, Father. What's important about that? Well, see, Abba it's a prayer of great familiarity. See, Abba was their word for Papa, the affectionate child. And so it's what a child speaks to their dad, See, so it's a prayer of great familiarity. So in helplessness, you got to address your God the way a little kid who's in pain addresses their mother or father. Some of you have been mothers, and when a little, or fathers, when a kid is, they always think you can make everything all right. You know, you run to mom or run to dad, somehow they can fix this, you know, and that's a powerful childish prayer. Jesus is to his father, Father, you're my dad, you can fix this, you know, Abba, Father. Then it's a prayer of great trust. Notice he says, all things are possible to you. Okay. Notice at that moment, it doesn't seem like all things are possible to the Father, you know. It seems like, you know, it's getting dark in the middle of the day. It's, you know, that there's no center. Remember Yeats' great line where he says, I don't believe anymore, the center doesn't hold. It looks like the center isn't holding, but in the middle of all this chaos, he says, I know you're still firmly Lord of the universe. Doesn't feel like it tonight, but you're still firmly Lord of this universe. And all things are possible for you. Then it's a prayer of complete honesty. He said, let this pass from me. I don't want to do this. You know, never lie to God. You know, the old thing about prayer is, you know, prayer means lifting mind and heart to God. Well, oftentimes we try to lift somebody else's mind and heart to God. You know, don't go and say, no, I want to do this. No, you don't want to do it. You know, notice this complete honesty. I don't want to do this. I don't know if I can do this. I don't want to do this. You know, see that you take your helplessness, your resistance and stuff to God, okay? And then ultimately it's a prayer of transformation. That prayer, what's going to happen is that, and notice he has to repeat it. Doesn't work the first time. He does it 3 times, you know. And then at the 3rd time, an angel comes and strengthens him. It's interesting. See, the angel comes. Well, the angel is God's strength. But when does the angel come? See, the angel can only come after the garden and the desert has done its work on you. See, there's a certain type of, and I'm going to talk that's what I mean by liminal space. Let me put these last 2 together. See, there's a certain grace of God. There is a certain experience of grace we can only have when we have completely exhausted our own resources. Let me give you an example of that from Scripture, a piece that's easy to miss. And that's John the Baptist, you know. John the Baptist, every time they come to John and they say, are you the Messiah? And remember, he always says, I'm not the Messiah. I'm not the Messiah, you know. And he says, in fact, I'm not even worthy to untie this guy's sandal strap. He said, there's somebody coming after me. He's the Messiah, and I'm not worthy to untie his sandal strap. Why not? He said, because I baptize with water, and he baptizes with fire. Water, fire. What's the difference between water and fire? Well, water works this way. Water washes you clean. You can wash something clean with water, but you can't change anything with water. See, remember Jesus, he says, he can take away the sins of the world. I can't. See, John can point out the sins of the world, but he can't forgive them. John can wash the soul clean, but he can't change the soul. See, Jesus can take away the sin of the world. Grace can change, or water only washes clean. You know, today, see, John the Baptist is deconstruction. It's valuable. John the Baptism is prophetic criticism. John the Baptism can name sin. He can point to sin. He can tell you what's everything that's wrong in the world. And we can do that on our own. You know, I can tell you everything that's wrong with George Bush, but I can't stop the war in Iraq. You know, I can point out all the sin in the world. I can't take any of it away. See, I can even tell you what's wrong with myself, but I can't change my behavior. You get the sense of that? See, that's John the Baptist. That's valuable. It's prophetic. A prophet said, this is what's wrong. But a prophet doesn't change it. See, that's baptism by water. Water is very important. John the Baptist is very important. He can name sin. He can show you what's wrong and so on, but he can't change it. Fire can change it. See, fire melts one element into another. Fire melts and changes and transforms and so on. See, I bring that up here. See, liminal space. Liminal space is space that changes us. See, sweating blood in the garden, where we run out of completely, when there's nothing left. You know, you're a stone's throw from everybody, you're sweating blood, your life is, there's nothing you do to help it. Then the angel can come and strengthen you. See, that's the only time the angel can come. See, then fire can enter our lives. That's the transformative moment. That's the moment when grace can take us. That's the moment where, then Jesus gets up, strengthened from the angel, and then he can walk to his death and give it over without resentment and so on. See, it's also the ultimate moment of grace, the ultimate moment of helplessness, the ultimate moment of loneliness, the ultimate moment of dying is also the ultimate moment of grace, because that's the entry for grace. And Scripture puts it into an image. Only after we're on the ground, sweating blood, and doing it repeatedly, can the angel come and strengthen us. Can God's strength really flow in, and the baptism by fire, which is Jesus' baptism, then liminal space can happen. See, when I have my normal kind of crises, the way you have, and I get over them pretty quick, and I might even take some counseling or this and that, actually not a hell of a lot changed in my life. And a year later, I'll have the same crisis again, because nothing's really transformed, If you go through the agony in the garden, you'll never be the same again. And if we do it right, see, then the angel comes, then we've gone into liminal space and fire. We move from John's baptism to Christ's baptism. And Christ's baptism changes us structurally. It melts one element into another. That's all in that wonderful expression, and the angel came and strengthened him. That angel can't come until we've opened ourselves up completely, until the loneliness and everything else brings us to a certain point. Then God can enter, then fire enters into our lives. John the Baptist understood that. That's why he said, never get me confused with the Messiah. Today we say, never get therapy confused with spirituality. It's wonderful, but therapy is not going to change you structurally. It's going to make you better and help your life and give you coping skills and so on and tell you what's wrong and so on. Who understands this? People have been addicted. They know that all the therapy in the world and all the understanding isn't going to change their behavior. Grace and community can change your behavior, and many of them have been on the ground. They sweated blood, and an angel can come and strengthen you, and then you can quit drinking. You can give up drugs. You can give up another addiction and so on. That's the baptism of Jesus. That's the baptism of fire and not the baptism of water. Okay. See, that's all the passion. Notice, I'm going to wind this up here now. That's all to do with when we can't help ourselves. See, so much of our active life right now, and it's John the Baptist life and so on, we're doing the active life of Christ. We're giving our lives for others, but we're also asked to give our deaths for others. And where Jesus begins to lead us into that is with our agony in the garden experiences, which are ultimately going to culminate with our death somewhere, because none of us will get off this planet alive. You can be sure of that, and see, so that sooner or later we have to enter the ultimate agony, agonia. In the meantime, we have these lovers' experiences of agony in the garden, which are developing our emotional and our moral athleticism. They're working our moral and emotional muscle so that when the great test comes, we're much more ready, And that was Jesus' great test. Jesus, the lover in the garden, not Jesus, the athlete in the garden who got beaten up, Not Jesus, the high priest, Jesus, the lover.